Alright, higher calling posse, saddle up. You faith-fueled swamp tortures. Welcome to day 7 of our 30 days of faith swamp brawl, where we're throat-punching chaos and moonwalking with Jesus. You're still swamp riding with me, holy guacamole. You're tougher than a buzzsaw gator on a moonshine rocket binge, and I'm slinging swamp air bazookas through the screen. We've been shredding it swamp style. Day 1. Starting your day with God. My tire shredding Tuesday got a prayer swamp nuke, boom. Chaos ate swamp mud. Day 2. Why faith matters every morning. Faith choke slammed my Wednesday grump swamp into grit. Day 3. Finding peace before the chaos. Peace ninja starred my Monday swamp meltdown into a hush riot. Day 4. A verse to carry you through. Joshua chapter 1 verse 9 napalmed my Tuesday swamp trash into a faith blaze. Day 5. Worship in the quiet moments. Psalm chapter 46 verse 10 unleashed a holy swamp ruckus through my Friday clown swamp. Day 6. Trust when you can't see. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1 torched my Thursday swamp fog into a trust-slinging win. Now, day 7's hurling a swamp gut buster. Hope that holds. Life's a swamp-fogged buzzsaw apocalypse. Mornings hit like a blind swamp cage match on a jet fuel roller coaster. But what if you could sling hope like a flaming swamp Molotov? Torch despair, and strut with God when the swamp's sinking? That's our swamp outlaw rumble today. Fam, picture this. Your swamp drowning, works a soul-sucking swamp vortex. Kids are glitter cannon gremlins. That coffee's lost in a swamp haze hole. Chaos blindsides you like a ninja with a jackhammer on a moonshine meth spree. But hope? That's your faith-forged swamp flamethrower. Blast through the swamp muck. Crank praise in the swamp dark. We're storming in for the next hour and a half. Got a swamp tale the day I was swamp sunk, till hope lit a holy swamp wildfire. Some swamp rattling napalm from Romans chapter 15 verse 13. And outlaw grade hacks to sling hope when you're swamp blind as a bat in a swamp blackout. No fluff, just raw. Swamp rowdy faith that torches the swamp haze. Grab your swamp brew, coffee, tea, heck, that swamp juice if you're feeling feral, and let's swamp blaze this trail. Higher Calling's swamp posse is unleashing a faith swamp riot. Day 7's hope with a triple shot swamp twist. America style. Alright, Higher Calling posse, lock your swamp spurs. You faith-fueled swamp blazers. We're roaring into day 7. Hope that holds. And it's time to sling some holy swamp napalm on why hope ain't just a fluffy bunny wish. It's your outlaw buzzsaw to shred despair and strut with Jesus when life's a swamp-choked buzzsaw apocalypse. You're still swamp riding, holy guacamole. You're tougher than a gator on a moonshine meth bender, and we're not hitting the swamp brakes. Life's a swamp-fogged chaos carnival. Mornings crash like a blindfolded cage match on a jet fuel roller coaster. Swamp muck snorting, horns blaring, works a soul-sucking swamp vortex. Kids are glitter cannon gremlins. Phones buzzing like a swamp hornet's nest on a rocket binge. Hope? That's your faith-forged swamp Molotov. Ignite it. Hurl it. Torch the swamp haze. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Our swamp rattling warhead. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him. That's not some swamp preacher's lullaby. It's God slinging a triple-shot swamp dare to crank hope when the swamp's sinking. Saddle up, posse. This ain't your granny's hope candle. It's a swamp faith riot to swamp bust the dark. America style. So, why's hope the swamp boss when life's a swamp apocalypse? 'Cause despair's a swamp fog blaster. Chaos swamp blinds you like a ninja with a jackhammer on a Red Bull rampage. Ever wake up to a swamp morning that's a 5-alarm swampocalypse, boss texting, fix it. Like a swamp drill sergeant on crack. Kids a homework ditching swamp gremlin. Coffee maker spewing swamp tar like a dragon with a grudge? That's me, pre-faith. I'm swamp drowning. Ears ringing louder than a swamp banshee on PCP. Heart jackhammering like a swamp roller coaster crash. No clue where God's at in that swamp stink despair. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. God of hope. That's not wishy-washy swamp fluff. It's God roaring. Crank hope, punk. I'm holding this swamp boat. Ever grope swamp blind and feel swamp sunk? That's faith. Hope's your swamp buzzsaw. Slice the swamp fog. Despair swamp chokes on its own swamp gas. Let's swamp sling it wild. Hope's your swamp VIP pass to God's war wagon. Life's a 24/7 swamp chaos circus, alarms shrieking like swamp banshees on a meth spree. Emails avalanching like a swamp mudslide. That neighbor's dog howling like it's auditioning for Swamp Judgment Day. Ever feel like you're dodging swamp grenades with a swamp sack over your head? That's me, pre-faith. I'm a swamp crash dummy. Faith swamp flatlining. Groping through swamp muck with no swamp GPS, God. Where's the swamp exit? But Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Fill you with joy and peace. That's your swamp outlaw badge, swamp fog thick. Hope slinging. God's swamp here. Ever crank hope and feel him swamp roll? That's the swamp juice, chaos swamp fogs. Hope swamp torches, God's bellowing. I'm your swamp boss. Why swamp mornings? 'Cause that's when despair swamp slams like a freight train on a moonshine bender. Psalm chapter 30 verse 5. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Ever wake to a swamp despair bomb, works a swamp black hole. Kids a swamp screaming gremlin. Phone's a swamp buzzsaw shredding your swamp soul? That's me, pre-faith. I'm a swamp piñata, boss snarling. Chaos swamp swinging. I'm cussing a swamp coffee spill like it's the swamp antichrist. Hope's DOA by 7. God of hope. That's your swamp Molotov, despair swamp chokes. You swamp ignite, God's swamp holding. Ever hope swamp blind and swamp own it? That's swamp faith, morning's swamp muck. Hope's swamp flamethrower. Swamp sling it rowdy. Despair's the swamp devil's smokescreen. Posse. Ever notice chaos swamp cranks the gloom? Phone pinging like a swamp piñata on a meth binge. Kids screeching like swamp gremlins on a sugar high. That car alarm wailing like a swamp foghorn's evil twin. That's Satan's swamp gas, swamp blind you. Swamp deafen you. Swamp ditch God in the swamp mist. Faith's a swamp flat tire. Hope's a swamp ghost. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Joy and peace as you trust. That's your swamp kill switch. Torch the swamp fog. Crank the swamp hope. God's roaring. I'm swamp here, punk. Ever ditch swamp despair and feel him swamp strut? That's me, post-faith. Despair's a swamp chump. Hope's a swamp buzzsaw. Chaos swamp chokes. Faith swamp smokes. Here's the swamp gut punch. Hope ain't swamp passive, it's swamp power-packed. Fill you with joy. That's not a swamp shrug. It's a swamp swagger, God's swamp flexing. Despair's swamp cowering. Ever feel life's a swamp choked brawl? Work's a swamp vortex. Kids a swamp glitter bomb. You're one swamp spill from a meltdown? That's me, pre-faith. I'm swamp derailed. Growling at a swamp toaster like it's the swamp apocalypse. Hope's a swamp no-show. I'm swamp toast. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Peace as you trust. That's your swamp rocket fuel, swamp fog rolls. Hope swamp roars. God's swamp got this. Ever hope swamp blind and feel it swamp shift, like, whoa, I'm swamp standing. That's swamp faith. Despair's swamp thick. Hope's swamp thicker. God's your swamp war boss. Why's it swamp faith fuel? Despair swamp jams your swamp soul. Lamentations chapter 3 verses 21 to 22. Yet this I call to mind and therefore I have hope, because of the Lord's great love. Ever grope swamp dark, God, where? And faith swamp flatlines. That's me, pre-faith. Swamp ears ringing, swamp soul sinking, no hope. Just swamp trash, God of hope. That's your swamp spotlight, swamp gloom rolls. Hope swamp crank, God's swamp here. Ever hope and feel swamp peace swamp hit? That's post-faith. I'm not a swamp mess, I'm a swamp megaphone. Hope's my swamp mic. God's my swamp anthem. Despair's a swamp chump. Swamp sling it wild. Hope's swamp rebel turf. Posse. America's a swamp hole. Hustle's swamp howling. Phone's swamp blazing like swamp banshees on a meth spree. That TV's swamp screaming infomercials like it's Swamp Judgment Day. Ever feel like hope's a swamp middle finger to the swamp gloom? That's me, pre-faith. I'm a swamp despair zombie. Swamp ears bleeding. No God in that swamp fest. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Fill you with all joy. That's your swamp outlaw swagger. Swamp blind hopes your swamp torch. God's swamp got me. Ever ditch swamp sight and feel swamp free? That's swamp faith. Despair's a swamp punk. Hopes your swamp posse. God's the swamp king. Practical swamp bite. Mornings are swamp dark. Ever wake to a kid's swamp SOS in a work swamp vortex? That's me. Flops a swamp despair tantrum. Redoes a hope swamp torch. God's swamp here. Ever hope swamp blind and swamp roll? That's swamp peace. Swamp fog fogs. Hope swamp blazes. I'm swamp set. Swamp landed. Hopes your swamp Molotov. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Your swamp war paint. Joy and peace. Swamp fog chokes. God swamp smokes. Hopes your swamp flamethrower. Despair's swamp roadkill. Ever hope swamp blind and swamp win? That's swamp faith. Next up. Swamp tail. Higher calling swamp slinging it wild. Stay swamp locked. Posse. Alright, higher calling posse. Strap your swamp boots. You faith-fueled swamp tortures. We're bulldozing day 7. Hope that holds. And it's time to sling a swamp gutted. Fog shredding tail that'll swamp slam you like a holy freight train on a moonshine meth bender. We've swamp blasted why hopes your outlaw buzzsaw. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. God of hope. Torched despair like a faith-forged swamp Molotov. Now, I'm swamp hurling you ringside for a Wednesday swampocalypse that nearly swamp drowned me in a fog-choked swamp pinata beatdown. Then hope swamp napalm the gloom with a triple-shot faith riot. This ain't no sleepy swamp preacher snooze, it's me. Raw, swamp ragged, and swamp roaring, starring as the chaos crash test swamp dummy in my own swamp muck meltdown. 2 swamp versions. One where I ditched hope and got swamp smoked like a swamp skunk on a bad day. And one where faith swamp torched the swamp haze and slung me a swamp win. Grab your swamp popcorn, or that swamp stew coffee if you're still swamp crawling out of the swamp muck, and let's wrestle this swamp gator of a day. America style. Picture it, Wednesday, 6 a.m. Alarm blaring like a swamp banshee on a moonshine karaoke rampage. I'd stayed up late wrestling a work flop, project tanked. Boss chewed me swamp style, and I'm running on swamp fumes. 3 hours of sleep, eyes like swamp gravel pits. Phones buzzing, boss texts. Redo it by noon, clients swamp pissed. Wife's hollering, car's dead, fix it. Kids whining, lunchbox broke. Swamp chaos isn't knocking. It's swamp pile driving through the wall like a monster truck on a meth-fueled swamp spree. Swamp horns blaring, swamp despair snorting. Ever wake up to a swamp day that's a 5-alarm swampocalypse, swamp blind, swamp deaf, and swamp dumb before your swamp boots hit the swamp muck? That's me, Wednesday, swamp round 1. I'm swamp down, swamp pinned, and swamp panting like a hog in a swamp twister. Version 1. No hope, no faith, just me, a swamp chugging crash dummy in a swamp blind buzzsaw beatdown. I stumble out, trip over the swamp kid's swamp toy, sorry, swamp champ, you're swamp collateral today, and hit the swamp kitchen like a swamp zombie apocalypse reject. Coffee maker's a swamp traitor, grounds exploding like a swamp volcano. Brews swamp tar, and I'm out of swamp bread. So kids' lunch is a sad PB&J swamp brick with crust screaming, swamp dad failed. Wife's yelling, car. I'm swamp crawling under the hood, snarling at a swamp battery deader than a swamp skunk. Kids whining, lunch. I'm tossing swamp crackers. Barking, eat swamp something. Don't swamp starve. Phones pinging, boss, redo it. Now, I'm thinking, yeah, it's swamp sunk, swamp pal, no hope, no, God, help, just me, a swamp grizzly on a moonshine bender. Juggling flaming swamp chainsaws swamp blindfolded, ready to swamp torch the whole swamp circus. Ever been that swamp clown? Where despair's the swamp ringmaster, and you're getting swamp pelted with flaming swamp pies? That's me, zero swamp chill, all swamp meltdown. Wednesday's got me in a swamp chokehold. I'm swamp tapping out by 7. Next swamp up, kids a swamp tornado. Lunch is a swamp crime scene. I'm yelling, stay out of my swamp hair. Car's swamp dead. I'm swamp kicking tires like a swamp lunatic on a meth spree. Cussing a swamp wrench like it's my swamp ex. Back home, Redo's a swamp dumpster fire. Data's swamp gone. I'm swamp slamming keys. Growling at a laptop buffering like it's swamp mocking me with swamp dial-up. Boss calls. Where's it at? I'm like, in swamp hell. Swamp man. Kids whining. Wife's swamp scowl could melt swamp steel. I Uber eats a swamp pizza. Project swamp toast. Boss is swamp fuming. I'm a swamp puddle of swamp despair by 9. No hope, no faith. Just a swamp blind tornado swamp wrecking my swamp vibe. Ever feel that? Where life's a swamp gator. And you're the swamp chump getting swamp chomped? That's Wednesday. No swamp light. No swamp win. Just a faith swamp flatlining swamp disaster flick starring yours truly. Now, swamp rewind. Same Wednesday. Hope swamp redo. Alarms still a swamp banshee on a karaoke rampage. I'm still a swamp zombie, but I don't swamp roll over and curse the swamp gods. I hit swamp pause, right there in the swamp sheets. And swamp growl. God, I'm swamp sunk. Swamp hope me. Quick swamp breath. Day 1 style. Breathe. Thank. Ask. Thanks I'm swamp kicking. Swamp's nuts. Swamp hold me. Then Romans chapter 15 verse 13 swamp napalms in. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him. Takes 15 swamp ticks, eyes swamp gritty. Brain a swamp stew, but I swamp hurl a hope Molotov, God. Swamp fill me. Ever swamp try that? Just a swamp ragged grunt when swamp despair's clawing your swamp guts? That's my swamp outlaw torch, swamp game on. Wednesday. Swamp kitchen still a swamp war zone, coffee's swamp tar. No swamp bread. I don't go full swamp Godzilla. God's swamp hope, sip the sludge. Smirk. Swamp fuel, hope you. Wife's hollering. Car. I swamp crawl under. Humming. Joy and peace, batteries swamp dead. I'm swamp grinning, not swamp growling. Kids whining. Lunch. I toss swamp crackers. Swamp trust. Bud. God's swamp here. We're swamp giggling. Not swamp griping. Cars swamp toast. I swamp call a toe. Whispering. Swamp hope holds, not swamp cussing. Just swamp chilling like a swamp faith outlaw. Redo? God. Swamp fill me. Grind it out. Send it swamp raw but swamp real. Boss doesn't swamp fry me. Swamp miracle. Kids swamp chaos. Wife swamp scowls. I swamp shrug. Hope's swamp got us. Pizza swamp rolls. We're swamp steady. Ever swamp hope blind and not swamp crash? That's swamp faith. Swamp fog's thick. Hope's swamp thicker. God's swamp here. What's the swamp diff? No hope me's a swamp volcano. Lava swamp spewing at cars. Kids. Swamp despair. Zero swamp wins. All swamp wipeout. Hope me's not swamp Iron Man. Cars still swamp dead. Redo's still swamp raw, but I'm not swamp erupting. Ever swamp notice that? Hope didn't swamp zap the swamp fog or swamp fix the swamp data. It swamp zapped my swamp despair. Joy and peace. Swamp gloom swung. I swamp danced. Ever swamp hope and swamp feel it? That's Wednesday. Faith swamp turned a swamp flop into a not today. Swamp devil. Swamp unpack the swamp juice. No hope me's a swamp despair zombie. Swamp staggering blind. Ever swamp grit your swamp teeth till you swamp crack? That's swamp flop, swamp circus. Swamp crashing hard. Hope swamp redo? I swamp slung the swamp mic. God. You swamp hope. Swamp despair didn't swamp lift. But my swamp vibe did. Hope's my swamp torch. Faith's my swamp roar. Ever swamp hope and swamp feel the swamp flip? That's swamp faith. Swamp despair's a swamp chump. God's the swamp boss. Practical swamp bite. Days are swamp dark. Ever swamp wake to a kid's swamp chaos SOS and a work swamp guillotine? That's me. Swamp flops a swamp despair tantrum. Swamp redo's a hope swamp torch. God's swamp here. Ever swamp hope blind and swamp roll? That's swamp peace. Swamp fog fogs. Hope swamp blazes. I'm swamp set. Swamp landed. No hope Wednesday's a swamp wreck. Swamp despair dummy. Swamp stay back. Hope Wednesday's a swamp banger. Joy and peace. Swamp despair choked. Faith smoked. Hope's my swamp Molotov. Chaos's swamp roadkill. Ever swamp hope blind and swamp win? That's swamp faith. Next swamp up. Swamp Bible. Higher callings swamp slinging it wild, stay swamp locked. Posse. Alright, higher calling posse. Lock your swamp spurs. You faith-fueled swamp tortures. We're swamp blitzing day 7. Hope that holds. And it's time to crack the good book like a vault of holy swamp napalm grenades. We've swamp slammed why hope's your outlaw buzzsaw. My Wednesday swampocalypse flipped from swamp despair pinata to hope slinging swamp warrior with Romans chapter 15 verse 13, swamp gut ripper. Now, let's swamp stomp into scripture. God's not slinging you some fluffy swamp lullaby. He's swamp dropping cage match swamp buzzsaws to school us on cranking hope when swamp muck's thicker than a gator's moonshine stew. We're swamp riding Romans chapter 15 verse 13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him. And Psalm chapter 42 verse 5. Why? My soul, are you downcast? Put your hope in God. These ain't swamp preacher snooze lines. They're God's swamp outlaw playbook for swamp torching despair when chaos is a swamp blind buzzsaw brawl. No swamp fluff, just swamp busting faith. Let's swamp sling some holy swamp heat and swamp rattle the swamp fog. America style. First swamp buzzsaw. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him. This ain't no swamp fairy dust wish bubble. It's God's swamp throwing a triple shot swamp Molotov in a swamp choked despair brawl. Picture Paul, swamp apostle. Swamp chains clanking. Swamp storms raging. Swamp chaos thicker than swamp gravy, yet he's like, swamp hope's my swamp jam. Ever feel life's a swamp muck apocalypse? Work texting, redo it. Like a swamp drill sergeant on a moonshine meth spree. Kids a swamp glitter gremlin. Phone buzzing like a swamp hornet's nest on a rocket binge? That's me, Wednesday swamp flop. Swamp ears swamp ringing. No hope. Just swamp despair swamp choking me blind. God of hope. That's God's swamp warhorn, crank it. Swamp punk. I'm swamp filling you. Ever swamp hope blind and feel him swamp torch it? That's swamp faith, swamp despair fogs. Hope swamp blazes, chaos swamp taps out like a swamp chump. Why's it a swamp hope banger? Fill you with joy and peace. That's not a swamp shrug, it's a swamp swagger, God's swamp flexing. Despair's swamp cowering. Ever notice swamp chaos swamp cranks the swamp gloom? Alarms shrieking like swamp banshees on a meth rampage. Emails avalanching like a swamp mudslide? That's me, pre-swamp faith. I'm a swamp crash dummy. Hope's DOA in that swamp racket. Romans chapter 15 verse 13, your swamp kill switch. Joy, swamp despair's a swamp pinata. Swamp chaos whacking away, but you're swamp cranking hope, God's swamp here. Ever swamp sling blind hope and feel him swamp roar? That's me. Post-swamp faith redo, swamp despair's a swamp chump. Hope's my swamp buzzsaw, God's swamp bellowing. I'm your swamp king. Next, Psalm chapter 42 verse 5. Swamp poet slinging swamp gold. Why? My soul, are you downcast? Put your hope in God. This ain't no swamp picnic, it's swamp David. Swamp tears streaming, swamp enemies circling. Swamp despair thicker than a swamp gator's moonshine brew. Ever feel life's a swamp dark death trap? Works a swamp buzzsaw vortex. Kids a swamp screaming swamp gremlin. Phone's a swamp foghorn on a meth rampage? That's me, Wednesday swamp flop. No hope, just swamp gloom swamp clawing my swamp guts. Put your hope in God. That's David's swamp outlaw move, swamp despair. Swamp off. God's swamp got me, swamp fog swamps. Hope swamp kicks, swamp chaos swamp blinks. Ever swamp hope blind and feel no swamp gloom? That's swamp faith. Hope in God, God's your swamp posse, swamp despair's swamp roadkill. Why swamp duo? Put your hope, God's not swamp ghosting, he's swamp stomping right there. Swamp despair's Satan's swamp smokescreen, ever swamp rope blind, God. Swamp where? That's me, swamp flop. No hope, swamp faith swamp flatlining in that swamp buzzsaw. Psalm chapter 42. 5's your swamp kill shot. Hope swamp now, trust swamp crank, swamp despair's swamp done. Ever swamp hope and feel him swamp side? That's swamp redo, Wednesday. Hope in God, swamp gloom swamp choked. Swamp faith swamp smoked, God's my swamp boss. Why swamp mornings? Swamp despair swamp lands at dawn. Lamentations chapter 3 verses 22 to 23. The Lord's great love, new every morning. Ever swamp wake to a swamp gloom bomb, works a swamp black hole. Kids a swamp chaos cannon. Phones a swamp buzzsaw? That's me, swamp flop. Swamp pinata. Hope's swamp toast by 7. Joy and peace. That's your swamp Molotov, swamp despair swamp roars. Hope swamp blazes, God's swamp new. Ever swamp hope blind and swamp slay? That's swamp faith, swamp mornings swamp dark. Hope's swamp flame, swamp tag team heat. Romans chapter 15 verse 13, your swamp torch. Fill you, God's swamp letting. Swamp despair's swamp bleeding. Psalm chapter 42. 5's your swamp posse. Hope in God, God's swamp stomping. Swamp chaos swamp dropping. Ever swamp feel that swamp combo. Swamp despair swamp who? That's swamp faith. Hope's your swamp war cry. God's swamp got me. Ever swamp sling it and swamp strut? That's swamp redo. Wednesday. Hope swamp now. Trust swamp kicked. Swamp despair swamp quit. Practical swamp bite. Swamp mornings are swamp dark. Ever swamp wake to a kid's swamp SOS in a work swamp vortex? That's me. Swamp flops a swamp despair swamp tantrum. Swamp redoes a hope swamp torch, God's swamp here. Ever swamp hope blind and swamp roll? That's swamp peace, swamp fog swamp fogs. Hope swamp blazes, I'm swamp set. Swamp land it, Romans and Psalm? Swamp napalm, joy, and hope swamp now, swamp despair's a swamp punk. God's the swamp king, hope's your swamp flamethrower. Swamp chaos's swamp roadkill, ever swamp hope blind and swamp win? That's swamp faith, next swamp up. Swamp hacks, higher calling swamp slinging it swamp wild, stay swamp locked. Swamp posse, alright, higher calling posse, saddle your swamp spurs. You faith fueled swamp tortures. We're swamp blitzing day 7. Hope that holds. And it's time to sling some holy swamp Molotov buzzsaws and swamp shred the swamp despair. We've swamp blasted why hope's your outlaw swamp torch. My Wednesday swampocalypse flipped from swamp despair pinata to hope slinging swamp king with Romans chapter 15 verse 13, swamp gut ripper. Scripture swamp smoked chaos, joy and peace, and hope in God, swamp hog tied swamp gloom in a swamp faith brawl. Now, it's swamp go time. How do you swamp crank this hope when swamp life's a swamp fogged buzzsaw swampocalypse? This ain't no fluffy swamp yoga hope circle, it's your swamp gutted. Chaos slaying swamp playbook to swamp hurl faith like a flaming swamp grenade when swamp muck's swamp sinking deeper than a gator's moonshine stew. We're swamp riding Romans chapter 15 verse 13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, with a 7-day swamp showdown to swamp lock it down. No swamp snooze, just swamp raw. Swamp rebel faith. Let's swamp torch this swamp despair and swamp crank hope loud. America style. First swamp torch. Plant hope like an outlaw snagging swamp loot at swamp dawn. Morning's your swamp heist. Swamp despair don't wait for swamp noon to swamp slam you swamp blind. Wake up. Swamp alarms a swamp banshee on a swamp meth swamp karaoke rampage, God. Romans chapter 15. Swamp hope me. Takes 10 swamp ticks, swamp sling it. Swamp growl it, swamp own it. Swamp eyes swamp gritty. Swamp brain a swamp stew. But you're swamp torching the swamp haze. Ever swamp wake to a swamp 5 alarm swampocalypse, swamp work texting, redo it. Like a swamp drill sergeant on a swamp meth binge. Swamp kids a swamp glitter cannon gremlin. Swamp phone buzzing like a swamp hornet's nest on a swamp rocket rampage? That's me, Wednesday swamp flop. No swamp hope, just swamp despair swamp pile driving me swamp blind. Swamp redo? God of hope, I swamp slung faith before swamp coffee brewed, hope swamp cranked. Swamp despair swamp choked, ever swamp snatch blind hope and swamp feel it swamp ignite, like holy swamp juice, God's swamp here. That's swamp step 1, swamp plant it deep. Swamp sling it early. Faith's your swamp outlaw buzzsaw. Next, swamp crank it all swamp day. Posse. Don't just swamp plant and swamp ghost. Swamp sling that swamp hope like a swamp boombox, swamp blasting, swamp outlaw, swamp jams. Swamp driving, joy and peace. Swamp kids whining, God's swamp filling. Swamp boss barking, hope's swamp here. Ever swamp loop a swamp riff, till it's swamp muscle, like that swamp jingle stuck in your swamp skull? That's me, Wednesday swamp redo. Swamp despair's a swamp stew. I'm swamp growling, joy. Not swamp cussing the swamp toaster like it's my swamp ex's swamp ghost. Swamp lunch, peace, not swamp hulking out at a swamp sandwich swamp flop. Ever swamp crank hope and swamp feel it swamp flex? That's swamp faith. Romans chapter 15 verse 13, my swamp war cry, swamp despair swamp roars. I'm swamp slinging swamp blind, hope's swamp pumping like a swamp V8 swamp tearing up a swamp backwater trail. Swamp how, swamp sling it swamp loud, swamp say it, swamp grunt it, swamp roar it, ever swamp mutter, I'm swamp set. That's me, Wednesday, hope's swamp here, swamp cars swamp dead. I'm swamp steady, not swamp flipping swamp birds like a swamp grizzly on a swamp moonshine bender. Swamp traffic, joy and peace, not swamp snarling. Just swamp chilling like a swamp faith outlaw. Ever swamp whisper hope and swamp feel the swamp zap? Take swamp zero, swamp shower, swamp car, swamp coffee swamp spill, God's swamp filling me. Wednesday swamp redo, hope swamp now, swamp redo swamp raw. I'm swamp humming, not swamp hammering swamp keys like a swamp despair swamp lunatic. Ever swamp sling it mid swamp gloom and swamp strut? That's the swamp heist, hope's your swamp mic. Faith's your swamp stage, God's swamp rocking. Swamp despair's swamp roadkill. Why swamp all swamp day? Swamp despair don't swamp clock swamp out. Psalm chapter 33 verse 20. We wait in hope for the Lord. Swamp days a swamp blind swamp buzzsaw. Ever swamp feel it swamp charge from swamp dawn? That's me, Wednesday swamp flop. No swamp hope, just swamp horns. Faith's swamp DOA by swamp 10. Fill you with joy, that's your swamp all day swamp outlaw swamp fuel, swamp despair swamp bucks. Your swamp steady, hope's your swamp spurs. Ever swamp hope swamp blind and swamp crush it? That's swamp redo, God's swamp filling, I'm not a swamp pinata. I'm a swamp posse, hope's my swamp saddle, faith's my swamp ride, swamp challenge swamp time, 7 swamp days. Swamp posse, swamp ignite it swamp tomorrow. Swamp day 1. Joy, swamp kid spills swamp glitter. Your swamp chill, swamp day 2. Peace, swamp traffic swamp fogs. Your swamp steady, swamp day 3. Hope's swamp here, swamp boss swamp growls. You swamp grin, swamp day 7. Swamp outlaw swamp swagger, swamp despair swamp storms. Hope swamp torches, swamp catch this swamp faith. Swamp chump, ever swamp stick a swamp riff and swamp own it? Swamp scribble it, swamp day 1. Swamp slung it, didn't swamp snap. Swamp flop, swamp reload, no swamp sweat. God's not swamp grading your swamp aim. He's swamp slinging your swamp napalm. Practical swamp grit, swamp no swamp time? 5 swamp ticks, hope's swamp here. Swamp shower, joy, swamp car, peace. Ever swamp sneak hope and swamp roll? Wednesday swamp redo. Romans chapter 15, swamp kids swamp chaos. I'm swamp steady, hope's my swamp outlaw swamp torch. Not a swamp tantrum, swamp despair swamp swings. Hope swamp fires, God's swamp got me. Ever swamp dodge a swamp meltdown with 1 swamp sling? That's swamp it, swamp crank it. Swamp despair swamp chokes. Faith's your swamp wild swamp card. Why's it swamp stick? Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11. Plans to give you hope and a future. Swamp despair swamp jams your swamp vibe. Ever swamp grope swamp blind, God. Swamp where? That's me, swamp flop. No swamp hope, just swamp stew. Faith's swamp flat. Swamp redo, joy and peace. Swamp caught the swamp gloom. Swamp torched the swamp crazy. Hope's swamp blazing. Swamp despairs swamp toast. Ever swamp hope and swamp feel it swamp light swamp up? That's swamp faith. Swamp despairs a swamp punk. Hope's your swamp posse. God's the swamp boss. Swamp paint it swamp style. Swamp day 1. Swamp alarms a swamp beast. Hope's swamp here. Swamp coffee swamp flops. You swamp smirk. Swamp day 2. Swamp kids swamp wild. Joy. Your swamp steady. Swamp day 7. Hope's your swamp rocket. Swamp despair swamp bucks. Faith swamp blasts. God's swamp here. Ever swamp surprise yourself with swamp chill? That's swamp you. Swamp next week. Swamp faith swamp outlaw swamp rocking swamp holy swamp napalm. Why Romans chapter 15. Joy. Swamp guts when swamp despairs a swamp bull. Peace. Swamp cover when it swamp roars. Ever swamp need both, swamp guts and swamp clue? Wednesday. Hope, for swamp kid swamp chaos. Peace, for swamp work swamp haze. Hope swamp kicked. Swamp despair swamp quit. Ever swamp sling it and swamp strut? That's swamp faith. Hope's your swamp war swamp horn. God's your swamp posse. Swamp landed. Swamp planted. Swamp crank it. 7 swamp days. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Your swamp outlaw swamp stash. Swamp sling it swamp daily. Hope swamp roars. Swamp despairs swamp roadkill. Higher calling swamp tearing it swamp loose. Swamp next swamp up. Swamp rap. Stay swamp locked. Swamp posse. Alright, higher calling posse. Day 7 swamp despairs torched. And y'all are faith-fueled swamp buzzsaw champs shredding this swamp rodeo. Big swamp props for swamp brawling this swamp chaos gator with me. You're tougher than a swamp bull on a moonshine rocket bender. And I'm swamp slinging swamp air bazookas through the swamp screen. We've been swamp napalming. Hope that holds like a holy swamp Molotov riot. Over an hour and a half of swamp despair swamp shredding swamp carnage. We swamp kicked off with hope as your swamp outlaw torch. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. God of hope. Swamp lit the swamp gloom like a faith-forged swamp buzzsaw. I swamp slung my Wednesday swampocalypse. Hope swamp flipped a swamp despair piñata into a swamp-slaying swamp win. Swamp scripture swamp smoked it. Joy and peace, and hope in God, swamp hog tied swamp chaos with swamp faith napalm. Then we swamp cranked it swamp practical, swamp plant hope. Swamp sling it all swamp day. 7 days swamp showdown swamp locked and swamp loaded. If you're still swamp riding this swamp chaos crushing swamp beast, you're a swamp faith swamp outlaw. Higher calling swamp posse is swamp tearing it swamp wild. America style. Let's swamp torch this swamp rap and swamp sling you off with swamp hope swamp ammo swamp blazing. Swamp quick swamp rewind. What did we swamp snag today? Hope ain't no swamp fluffy swamp prayer. It's your swamp forged swamp napalm. Your swamp despair shredding swamp Molotov when swamp life's a swamp muck swampocalypse. Swamp day 1 swamp prayer swamp nuked my swamp Tuesday swamp tire swamp shredder. Psalm chapter 143 verse 8 swamp smoke swamp chaos. Swamp day 2 swamp faith swamp choke slammed my swamp Wednesday swamp grump swamp. Romans chapter 12 verse 2 swamp lit swamp grit. Swamp day 3 swamp peace swamp ninja starred my swamp Monday swamp meltdown. Psalm chapter 23 verse 4 swamp hushed the swamp storm. Swamp day 4 swamp slung Joshua chapter 1 verse 9. Swamp torched my swamp Tuesday swamp trash into a swamp faith swamp blaze. Swamp day 5 swamp cranked swamp worship in the swamp hush. Psalm chapter 46 verse 10 swamp turned my swamp Friday swamp circus into a swamp holy swamp ruckus. Swamp day 6 swamp trust swamp torched my swamp Thursday swamp fog. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1 swamp made swamp chaos swamp roadkill. Now, swamp day 7 swamp hope. Romans chapter 15 verse 13, joy and peace, is your swamp outlaw swamp war swamp horn, swamp despair swamp fog swamp up. Swamp hope swamp torches, God's swamp roaring. I've swamp got your swamp 6. Ever swamp hope swamp blind and swamp feel the swamp muck swamp lift like. Swamp holy swamp juice, swamp despairs swamp toast. That's swamp faith. Hope's your swamp buzzsaw. Swamp chaos's swamp roadkill, Swamp posse's swamp rocking the swamp haze. Swamp big swamp alert. Swamp hopes your swamp turbo. Swamp fam. Swamp life's a swamp fog choked swamp freight swamp train. Swamp mornings swamp hit like a swamp blindfolded swamp cage swamp match on a swamp jet swamp roller coaster. Swamp works a swamp vortex swamp spewing swamp haze. Swamp kids swamp slinging swamp glitter swamp bombs. Swamp phones a swamp banshee on a swamp meth swamp binge. Swamp despair swamp wants you swamp sunk. God swamp wants you swamp locked. God of swamp hope. It's not a swamp shrug. It's a swamp swagger. Swamp chaos swamp blinks. Swamp faith swamp kicks. Ever swamp ditch swamp despair and swamp feel him? That's Swamp Wednesday swamp redo. Swamp hope swamp turned a swamp meltdown into a swamp faith fueled swamp mic swamp drop. God swamp here. I'm not a swamp pinata. I'm a swamp posse swamp slinging swamp joy. This 30 swamp day swamp faith swamp halls swamp stacking swamp wins. One swamp blind swamp hope swamp torch. Then swamp another. Swamp chaos swamp gets swamp smoked every swamp dang swamp day. Swamp next swamp move. Swamp tomorrow. Swamp posse. Swamp sling it swamp style. Swamp crack that swamp Bible. Or your swamp phone if you're a swamp fog blind swamp cowboy. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. Swamp joy. Swamp torch it. God. Swamp fill me. Swamp hope swamp now. Swamp crank it. Swamp peace swamp here. Takes 15 swamp ticks. Swamp sling it in swamp bed. Swamp shower. Over that swamp stew swamp coffee. Before swamp chaos swamp storms swamp in like a swamp bull on a swamp meth swamp rampage. That's swamp day 1 of 7. Swamp ride it. Swamp posse. Swamp day 3. Swamp maybe you're not swamp growling at swamp despair. Swamp day 7. You're a swamp hope slinging swamp outlaw. Swamp chaos swamp charges. Swamp faith swamp torches. Swamp catch this swamp hope. Swamp chump. Ever swamp hope swamp blind and swamp own it? Swamp drop a swamp comment. Swamp day 1. Swamp slung it. Didn't swamp snap. I'm swamp reading every swamp tale. Swamp swear on my swamp kids swamp glitter swamp pile. Swamp sub swamp up. Swamp day Aidza. Swamp strength in swamp weakness. We're swamp cranking swamp hotter than a swamp Texas swamp chainsaw. Swamp don't swamp sweat the swamp flops. I'm the swamp despair swamp crash swamp king. Swamp Wednesday swamp no hope me? A swamp volcano. Swamp lava swamp spewing at swamp cars. Swamp kids. Swamp despair. Zero swamp chill. All swamp swampocalypse swamp wipeout. Swamp hope me? Not swamp iron swamp man. Swamp cars still swamp dead. Swamp redos still swamp raw. But I'm not swamp torching my swamp vibe. Swamp joy and swamp peace. Swamp chaos swamp choked. Swamp faith swamp smoked. Ever swamp bomb and swamp bounce? That's swamp this. Swamp no swamp guilt. Just swamp grit. Swamp miss a swamp day? Swamp kids a swamp banshee. Swamp phones a swamp buzzsaw. Swamp reload. God's not swamp grading your swamp hustle. He's swamp slinging your swamp napalm. Ever swamp hope swamp and swamp crush it? That's swamp you. Swamp next swamp week. Swamp faith swamp outlaw swamp rocking swamp holy swamp haze. Swamp why's it swamp worth it? Swamp days swamp muck swamp up like a swamp stew. Swamp chaos swamp don't swamp play swamp fair. Ever swamp start swamp sunk and swamp crash by swamp lunch? That's swamp me. Swamp no swamp hope. Just swamp fumes. Swamp toast by swamp noon. Ever swamp hope swamp blind and swamp slay the swamp gloom? That's swamp faith. Romans chapter 15 verse 13 swamp lid me when swamp despair swamp should have swamp won. Swamp Wednesday swamp redo swamp wasn't swamp Hollywood. Swamp car swamp didn't swamp spawn. But I swamp didn't swamp lose my swamp soul. Swamp hope swamp crank swamp joy. Swamp faith swamp crank swamp me. This 30 swamp day swamp halls swamp piling swamp muck busting swamp wins. One swamp blind swamp hope swamp torch. Swamp then swamp another. Till you're a swamp faith swamp inferno swamp shredding swamp chaos. Swamp real swamp talk. Swamp y'all are swamp like. Swamp cool. But I'm swamp sunk. Swamp works a swamp vortex. Swamp kids are swamp gremlins. I swamp feel swamp ya. Swamp life's a swamp muck choke swamp meat swamp grinder. Swamp mornings are a swamp blind swamp bull swamp run. Swamp hope's a swamp unicorn. Swamp right, swamp wrong. Swamp sling it in the swamp cracks. 10 swamp ticks over swamp coffee, God. I'm swamp sunk. Swamp hope swamp me. 5 swamp seconds at the swamp sink, swamp peace. Ever swamp sneak swamp hope and swamp not swamp explode? That's swamp Wednesday. Swamp joy, swamp despair swamp roared. I swamp rocked. Swamp hopes my swamp war swamp horn. Swamp glooms swamp roadkill. You swamp don't swamp need a swamp cave. Just swamp guts to swamp sling swamp it. Higher calling swamp posse swamp don't swamp blink. Swamp last swamp zinger. Psalm chapter 71 verse 14. As for swamp me, I will swamp always swamp have swamp hope. That's your swamp stash, swamp joy swamp unseen, swamp locked swamp in. Swamp despair swamp can't swamp snatch swamp it. God's swamp roaring, I'm swamp here. Ever swamp feel that swamp hope swamp torch, I'm swamp set. That's swamp faith, swamp despair's your swamp chump. Swamp hope's your swamp posse, God's the swamp boss. Swamp final swamp shove, swamp tomorrow. Swamp posse, swamp ignite swamp it. God, Romans chapter 15. Swamp hope swamp blind. Swamp watch, swamp despairs swamp nuts. Your swamp chill, swamp kids swamp chaos. Your swamp steady, swamp hope swamp slays. Swamp gloom swamp praise. Swamp day 8. Swamp strength in swamp weakness, we're swamp digging swamp deeper. Swamp don't swamp ditch. Swamp fam, swamp bring your swamp coffee. Your swamp muck, your swamp grit. Higher calling swamp tearing swamp it swamp loose. Swamp big swamp thanks for swamp riding. You swamp could have swamp binged swamp reruns. But you're swamp slinging swamp faith with swamp me. That's swamp no swamp small swamp potatoes. Your swamp posse, swamp sleep swamp tight. Swamp tomorrow's swamp got a swamp hope swamp torch swamp waiting to swamp blaze. Swamp drop, swamp day 7. Swamp hoped. Swamp winning, higher calling swamp posse. Swamp let's swamp keep this swamp faith swamp inferno swamp roaring. Swamp catch swamp yaw swamp soon. God swamp bless. Swamp y'all.